Welcome back to Air Quality Matters. Just over 2 years ago, I sat down for the first time and said these words. We already have the tools and knowledge we need to make a difference to the quality of the air we breathe in our built environment. The conversations we have and how we share what we know is the key to our success. I meant it then, and I mean it now. And 100 episodes and some 1.5 million spoken words later, I sit down with my very first guest on the podcast. I'm Simon Jones, and coming up, a conversation with Max Sherman. Max was a senior scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory with a research career that spans over 40 years. Flick through any paper on air quality or look at any standard, and there is a better chance than not Max's fingerprints are in there somewhere. But most of all, Max is one of the most genuine players in the industry. It was, in fact, the kind of conversations I had with him and others that inspired me to start recording this stuff. So I think it's fitting that we sit down at episode 100 and reflect a little on the last couple of years, catch up on some of the progress we have made, and test some of the ideas both he and others are thinking about at the moment. We discuss some of the topics that have floated to the top regularly in the podcast, like health, sensors, pollutants, standards, and spend a little time looking at what's happening with the harm work he and others have been so influential in bringing to life. I really hope you enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it. It was really interesting to think back at some of the topics we've discussed on this podcast over the last couple of years. Please don't forget to check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. Without them, this stuff just simply wouldn't be possible. This is a conversation with Max Sherman. Well, I really appreciate you speaking to me again, Max. Believe it or not, over 2.5 years ago, I just had this notion. And do you know what? Funnily enough, it was following I think it was probably an AIVC conference, and I can't remember where. Instinctively, I think it was one maybe in Belgium somewhere. But I came away from that conference, and I'd had a couple of conversations like we often do at these things. And it was yourself, there was Pavel Wargocki, and Ian Walker was involved, and it was just one of those kind of lunchtime chats where we'd spent a good hour just talking rubbish, right? Just really interesting conversations about this, that, and the other. And I remember distinctly coming away from that conversation thinking, I shouldn't be the only one that gets to hear these conversations. You know, the value of a conversation and finding different ways to talk about a technical subject and have the time to express ideas and investigate things as you do in a conversation. You can be in very fortunate positions in certain circumstances, you know, at conferences and events and exhibitions and things like that, but not many people get to hear it. And I came away from that thinking, and at the time I happened to be listening to some podcasts, and I came away thinking, I wonder if this is something that is worth doing. And I remember reaching out to you and a couple of other people saying, hey, don't suppose you'd take a chance and come and have a chat with me for an hour or so on air quality. And you were incredibly gracious to sit down with me. And it was the first episode of the Air Quality Matters podcast. And I say at the beginning of each podcast that I believe we often have the solutions we need to improve the quality of the air we breathe indoors. And it's the conversations we have and how we share what we know is the key to our success. And I genuinely believe that. I think there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of expertise and a lot of good people out there. That the trick is getting that information out and out of the silos that it exists in. So believe it or not, it was 2 years ago, and 100 episodes later, some 1.5 million spoken words of conversation, thankfully not all me, and I will shut up in a minute. Here we are. And I really appreciate you coming back on to have another chat to me, because I thought it'd be quite nice to kind of reflect a little bit on the last couple of years and where we've come from.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Max. I don't know about you. I mean, and I don't know if this just happens, but certain themes seem to have really floated to the top in those 100 episodes. And it's interesting to me. I sat down today reflecting on this a little bit, thinking, what were the things that came to mind? And one of the things that certainly has seemed to move in the last couple of years is a focus on health and indoor air quality. And I know that's always been there, but I've seen the medical community coming in and getting involved with the engineers more and more than I've ever seen it before. I've seen standards and regulation reflecting the health impacts of indoor air quality more than I've seen it before. That for me has been probably one of the standouts, and some serious reports like the Royal College of Surgeons or Physicians in London did a very big report on the impacts of indoor air quality on health. That does seem to be moving a little bit. Do you get that sense from your perspective, Max, that this interdisciplinary thing seems to be catching some momentum?
I think that's true, although it's been slowly growing for a long time. ASHRAE realized in the 80s that it should start looking at things like environmental health issues, but only could do qualitative sorts of things at the time. What's really evolved over time is the ability to do things slightly more quantitatively. Engineers aren't any good at, things unless they can calculate, draw, design, do something with numbers. Whereas in the medical community, they have practices that they believe are the best, but they don't really have good numbers. They're not good at optimizing things and trading things off, which is what engineers have to do all the time. So it's been growing over time, and there have been a lot of developments in different areas of science, medicine, engineering that have allowed us to do a better and better job over the last 40 years.
Do you think it in the reverse direction a little bit as well? There's been real progress in our ability to measure indoor environments as well, much more practically on the ground, and perhaps there's that context or frame of reference that maybe hasn't been there before, that we're able to say, it's too early to get the kind of the epidemiological evidence of that, but certainly we're able to start to ask the question, tell me why the environment isn't a good reason for the symptoms I'm seeing before me, and let's have a look and measure spaces to see what's happening.
Well, that's right. All those things happen, and they're all of a package. You may know that something is toxic, but you may not know how much it affects somebody at low levels over what time. You need studies, either epidemiological studies or toxicological studies or longitudinal studies to try to figure out all these things. You can't do anything with it much in an indoor environmental context unless you can actually turn it into something so that you can figure out how much does it cost to do this, both in terms of somebody's health and in terms of whatever it takes to mitigate it.
Yeah, and we think doing research is expensive in our neck of the woods, but when you're starting to do big, large-scale, double-blind, clinical trials, it's a whole different ballgame. And if you really want to understand the direct straight lines between environment and health impacts, that stuff's really complex to do. It takes a lot of momentum to get big research in the right areas.
Right. It's even worse than that, because just doing that kind of study in a clinical environment is one thing. But when you're talking about environmental health, you're talking about exposures over 20 years. So it's really hard to do a study where you can control groups over 20 years and get some sort of statistically meaningful kind of thing. That's very hard to do. And we've done it indirectly in only a very few areas like PM.
Yeah, and that's been a real treat for me actually over the last couple of years, is having gotten to speak to some really good epidemiologists, about their work. And it's a real art form, it's a real body of science that does some amazing stuff with big data and big longitudinal clinical trials over many years, and like some amazing information if you can figure out how to root it out and pull it out. But they're big endeavors. Like they could be huge endeavors, these big national epidemiological trials, you know.
Yes, yes, they are. And the best data often comes incidentally, where somebody had to collect data for some other reason and you can link it to health effects. So, but yes, it's quite tough to do.
I mean, the other thing, and it was the case when we were talking a couple of years ago, but it seems, you know, we're very much in a post-pandemic environment, and that's not surprising. I mean, it was a global pandemic. It was airborne. It significantly changed the built environment's focus on the spaces we occupy from a risk perspective. But it also saw an industry and a built environment gearing up for a change that on the whole that people have felt hasn't manifested in the way that they'd have hoped. And that seems to have continued. We still seem to be feeling the repercussions of that, of this huge spike in interest and a disappointment in expectation following it, that somehow things might change and they haven't quite. In whatever it is, you know, if you're manufacturing air filters or you do air quality monitoring in schools or whatever it is, like generally the consensus over the last 2 years and 100 episodes has been general disappointment.
I think that's true because we who work in the field say, oh my God, look, now the interest is there. Now we can do all these things that we talked about doing, but nobody cared about. Now they care about them. But that caring fades over time. Everybody's focused on the latest crisis. And now that we're several years post-pandemic and, you know, most people have survived it, or those who have survived it don't worry about it much anymore between vaccinations and treatments and that sort of thing. So the pandemic itself is not a front of mind activity. Now, it left a lot of us with the notion that we can and should do better, and there is still higher interest than there was pre-pandemic, but nothing like the spike. Rarely do IAQ researchers walk down Broadway in Manhattan and have people banging pots out their windows like they did during the COVID epidemic.
Yeah, true. And I've asked this question a couple of times, you know, if you take the spike of interest out, do we think we're still making a kind of linear progress? And I think the consensus is, yeah, kind of. So like we're still making progress. It's just in the context of that huge spike in interest, it feels like a backward step somehow. And
Right.
you know, a lot of organizations put a lot of money into ideas that never manifested, and you know, it's cost them, you know, so that, you know, there is a lot of hurt out there as well. People have built products or developed supply chains or tried to set up businesses to do what they think was going to come next, and it just hasn't happened, or hasn't happened at the scale that they needed it to.
That's right. It's a bubble in that sense, just like we have other technological bubbles that people try to grab a hold of and hope that they can do well before the bubble eventually bursts. But I think you're right. The bubble has burst, but the level is higher than it was before the bubble. So people are generically more sensitive to IAQ issues than they were before, but they're not as sensitive as perhaps we would like.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, there's a whole section of our community that feels a little bit left behind post-pandemic, that have been left with picking up the pieces of now having long COVID or still being vulnerable to infectious disease and so on. And they really are kind of looking at the ship sailing away and people getting on with their lives going, hang on a minute, you know, what about us? This still sucks, you know, and affects our lives on a daily basis. And you know, it isn't quite as post-pandemic as you think it is, you know, and that's been a real narrative over the last couple of years as well. Whole groups of communities that see the chance that the pandemic presented and see the missed opportunities that it left.
Well, that's right. I mean, the pandemic was not a good thing, of course. It was a horrible thing. We hope the small silver linings are that we can learn a little bit from it so that next time we can mitigate the harm that happens. And so those of us left in the indoor environment field are trying to learn what we can and produce what we can to help the future.
One of the interesting things I think the pandemic did do was concentrate people's minds that there's stuff that can float in the air, and particles and viruses and those kind of things came front of mind. And I think one of the areas that has held interest is particulate matter, because not long after that we had wildfires as well. So PM and the soot and dirt and things that float in the air is still a conversation point, isn't it? And that there has been a real focus on that over the last couple of years.
That's right. I think we know that respiratory diseases are transmitted on particles, on aqueous aerosols in the air. So they're just like particles that can be of carbon or dirt or anything else that can be filtered out. So the particles is job one, I think, in the indoor environment. We want to get rid of them for all these reasons, not for long-term health, for infectious disease control, for a whole bunch of reasons. And we've learned that in the last 20 years, and most especially from COVID. So my hope is that will be front of mind a lot longer, that filtration and the technologies to remove particles, which are pretty fully developed, will be implemented more and more. And it's a win-win kind of situation.
I think what's fascinating about particles and particulate matter and the health impacts on the body is that it's enormously complex and really interesting, from an air chemistry perspective, from a fluid dynamics perspective, from an engineering perspective, from an effects on the body perspective. It's multi-system impacts. Like it's a fascinating area that's getting a lot of attention. But interestingly, it's one of those things that's relatively straightforward from an engineering controls perspective to sort out. We know what we're doing with things that float in the air. We can get rid of them. We can catch them. We can remove them from spaces. There's some low hanging fruit that we can apply to something that's so fundamentally problematic to our health and well-being, and we can really do something about it. I think that's been a real eye-opener for me over the last couple of years, is having really interesting conversations about how complex this stuff is, but at the same time knowing that we've got the tools in our arsenal to really have a big impact on indoor spaces with it.
Yeah, I think the science is fascinating. The engineering is not. We know how to fix it. We don't really care about the fine points of the science in terms of fixing the problem. It's like if you have a moldy building, you don't really care what the species of mold is. You just want to get rid of the mold. So there might be some fascinating science to the people who study mold, but you just want to get rid of it. The same thing with particles. What you want to filter them out. And there's very little science you need to sort that out. Most of that's developed. So it is an implementation issue of improving the amount of filtration in every building.
Or local exhaust ventilation to get rid of sources as they're being generated, things like cooker hoods and things like that. So this stuff is just really real basic 101 ventilation and engineering, isn't it? Which is great in that sense.
Right. And the big benefit is over the last decade or so, we've been able to quantify what that is worth, and therefore tells you how much resource you should be willing to put into mitigating it, which is not always something we're able to do. We can know that some chemical is bad for you, but we don't know how bad in terms of some resource or money or something that we can make engineering trade-offs with.
Yeah, and we'll definitely come on to the kind of the harm work that you did a bit later on. But I imagine if you didn't know the results you were going to get, but I think most people suspected that particulate matter would be pretty high on the list, right? But even if you didn't know, you'd be very pleased to find out that of all the pollutants that you could find as being the major problem, PM was it, because you're like going, well, thank God for that. We've got solutions for that one. If it was some quirky ozone related air chemistry thing going on, you'd be like, oh, Jesus, right, this is going to be harder to fix than I thought. But PMs, you're like, okay, yeah, we got this.
Right. But at the turn of the century, we didn't know that. We did not. We would not have picked PM as the bad guy. We might have picked ozone. We might have picked formaldehyde. There were lots of things, but PM was not really on the radar until a few years after that, when people started to get the idea that maybe particles were really causing more disease than people thought. So that did change in the last quarter of a century.
And that's been the interesting thing that, as I've spoken to the medical people, the really understanding the mechanisms of the body in particulate matter, its ability to cross cell membranes and tissue membranes, and its ability to be transported to every organ of the body. And, I've been talking about it a lot recently, just recognizing that our bodies are actually pretty efficient delivery systems for particulate matter to our organs. And that's happening from the day that we're born to the day that we die. And there's nothing we can do about that. That's just the way the body works. So we only have one choice. This isn't something you can be vaccinated against. Your lungs are going to absorb fine particulate matter and spread them around the body, and in whatever chemical, metal, whatever the damaging form of it is, it's finding its way to our brain and our lungs and our livers and our heart and so on and so forth. And it makes the problem simpler in a lot of ways, is that we just need to get particles out of the air that we're breathing. That's it.
That's right. Now, of course, you can never get rid of 100% of everything. So that's when the quantification comes in, is to, what's a reasonable level. And you can do that with numbers, or you can do that with expert judgment, but you're going to have to do it somehow.
Yeah. And again, that's been a real topic of conversation over the last couple of years as well, has been the subtlety of risk, the nuance of risk, the trade-offs, the different tolerances of risk, the people accepting different risk levels, that this ultimately is a risk game. And one of the things that's really made this topic more complex is bringing the broader indoor environmental quality thing into play. So starting to try and tie together the broad church of indoor environmental quality. And now you're starting to think about not just the impacts of air quality, but the impacts of lighting and thermal comfort and acoustics and all these different measures. And it makes the picture much more complex. We're getting into a very complex space with indoor environmental quality.
Yes, we certainly are. And sometimes people get lost down those rabbit holes by talking about things like, well, if you have all three of these things happening at once, do they interact? Well, that's not a bad question if you first know how they all interact individually. So, and that we often don't know that. So, you don't want to get lost in the complexities before you've done some of the first order effects of saying, well, what's important? There are some things like the ozone and other reactive oxygen species that do depend on what they're combined with to do it, because there's some chemistry. But in general, there isn't. Things are additive pretty closely. And you may want to figure out what the interaction is later on, but first go for the big things and then worry about the little things when you've sorted out the big things.
Yeah. And one of the simple aspects of a lot of the air quality discussions is it's about stuff that does you more or less harm. And often it's about reducing your exposure to that. Some of the other indoor environmental quality challenges are a bit more complex than that in a lot of ways. Things like thermal comfort or discomfort, some of the targets and things that we're trying to achieve, you can make very solid arguments that adaptive comfort comes into play, that actually you want to stress the body a little bit, you want to make it work a little bit harder. There's a lot of gray areas in this stuff, and it's interesting to see how those conversations are starting to interact with the air quality conversations about, as I joked with Pavel not so long ago, that there's no adaptive tolerance to formaldehyde, right? There's no good level of it that you can be exposed to that helps you in some way. But there is a certain amount of heat stress that's probably good for the body to make it more resilient and make it more adaptive. So they're different conversations.
Right. And there's also some qualitative differences that we're not very good at sensing when we're being exposed to some cancer causing agent, but we know when we're warm or cold. I mean, we're thermal sensors. We're not indoor air quality sensors. But after all, a vaccination is kind of a stress test for infection. The first vaccinations were, live versions of what you were trying to get protection against. So you can argue that there's a kind of a threshold that's good for you if you do it right there too. And I have no idea if there's some level of ozone that's good for you or not. But we know that at higher levels of ozone, formaldehyde and particulates, it's not good for you.
One of the ones that is up for debate and is a kind of a perennial topic that seems to come round every decade or so is mold. And mold has definitely been a theme over the last year or two. Obviously, we had the tragic death of a young boy in social housing in the UK from exposure to mold, which really triggered a whole cascade of regulatory and legislative changes to try and protect tenants in social housing. And that pattern, unfortunately, happens, as I say, every couple of decades. The US had its moments a few years back, I think in the early 80s, that it was tied to some deaths. It turned out not to be the cause, but it triggered a lot of national interest in mold back then. We're seeing it again now. We're seeing a rise in interest in chronic inflammation or chronic inflammatory response syndrome and all that goes with that. So that's definitely been a topic. But interestingly, mold is one of these ones where I've asked the question and there aren't clear answers. I think most people accept a sterile environment isn't healthy for anybody. So perhaps at some level there is some level of exposure to the microbiome that's healthy for humans. But understanding where that is really hard.
That's right. We know we don't want to be completely isolated from the microbial environment. I mean, recently these peanut studies have shown that a lot of that was due to over isolating children from proteins that they would have adapted to. Mold is in some ways like PM. We know that when it's problematic, it's because of moisture levels. And we know how to fix moisture levels. It just costs money. In the US, we had mold problems over a period in part because of air conditioning that was made too efficient in the sensible sense of removing heat at the expense of not removing moisture. And you could get sick building syndrome and mold infections because things were too humid. And a lot of that is true in these mold cases. I've been on a few expert mold cases where it's always the moisture level that's the problem. And then the lawyers have to figure out who should pay for that. But we know how to fix it. It's just costs money. And if you don't want to put in air conditioning in certain houses, or it's not always from the air, sometimes it's from leakage, groundwater, rain penetration, but it's almost always moisture which is causing the mold problem.
The reality is, mold needs three things to flourish, food, temperature and moisture. And the reality is that food and temperature is the one thing that we will always give it in the indoor environment. So moisture is our only lever really when it comes to managing the proliferation of it in a space, because mold spores will always be in our environment. You know, they're ever present. I think the interesting thing with the mold thing has been the medical links and the potential symptoms as a result of exposure to mold is very complex and heavily what's the word I'm looking for? Contentious, I think, in the medical community, you know, because they could be such a wide range of reactions to exposure to mold at all sorts of levels. It can be very difficult to pinpoint cause and effect. And a lot of people that suffer from being in spaces with damp and mold horribly that feel like they're not heard. So when I look at, because I do this midweek thing where I look at papers and reports coming out, and one of the machines that just keeps churning out papers and research is mold. You know, it's just one of those ones that we just still keep trying to look at and understand.
And from the medical point of view, it's fascinating. It's interesting. It has all these complexities. But from the indoor environmental point of view, just keep things dry and we don't have to worry about all those complexities. It's very similar to the PM in that sense, that if we just don't let it happen, we don't have to know the details of what the problem is when it does happen.
Yeah, I mean, there was a really interesting study I had a reference there a few weeks back that was looking at the incidence of uncontrolled adult asthma in homes with mold, and they were basically looking at the size of mold, visible mold in a space, and the conclusion of that study was that, you know, for vulnerable people, there's no safe level or no acceptable level of or tolerable level of visible mold in a space. If you've got mold, you need to sort the problem out. I mean, regardless of the complexities of the potential medical symptoms and issues, the solution, as you say, is pretty simple. We need to get rid of mold in homes. You know, that there's no, a little bit of black mildew around a windowsill, fine, you know, or around your shower tray. But the moment you're finding it on surfaces, generally, it's a symptom of a building failure in some way,
That's right.
isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. It's in simplest terms. Yeah. So I think the thing that has continued to make progress in the background, and it's been really encouraging to see, has been standards. You know, this is something that reacts to certain events like the pandemic, as we saw with 241, but also the stock and trade of some of the ventilation standards that we work on continue to progress in the background. And I know you've been involved in across the board in those, and certainly keep an eye on what's going on.
Yes, I've been involved in standards a long time, and the standards continue to evolve as the science behind them evolves. We want to make standards as flexible as possible to achieve whatever their goal is, and so we revise them, and then sometimes the goal shifts one way or the other depending on what the standards committee thinks the objective is. Of course, the newest standard is ASHRAE Standard 241, which is a standard for infectious aerosol control, which was created as a result of the pandemic. And that's over and above any of the indoor air quality standards. And for the future, we're likely to be moving more towards integrated indoor environmental quality standards, not just indoor air quality standards. So a lot of things are going on a lot of levels, and the key thing will be making them useful enough so people will want to adopt them, so that the policymakers and the politicians and the program writers will think, yes, I want this and I will adopt this.
Yeah, and talking of one of those standards, 62.2, as from some of the work that we've spoken about on the podcast, both with you at the very beginning in episode 1, but also with Ben Jones later on around harm intensity, some of that work has made progress into the kind of ASHRAE 62 standards, isn't it?
Yes, if we're talking about the harm science, then what we're talking about is making a quantitative evaluation of indoor air quality. And the 2025 version of 62.2 has that in it as an alternative procedure. So you can do what's always been in that standard, which is ventilation rates, basically, some other requirements, but basically setting a ventilation rate, or you can use this alternative procedure, which has to do with contaminant levels. And you can use a much lower ventilation rate if you can demonstrate that you controlled the key contaminants.
Those key contaminants were a direct result of the harm work, where we've just been talking about PM. That was one of the ones that floated to the top as one of the major pollutants of interest. But also in there you had formaldehyde and NO2, amongst others, but they were the top three, weren't they?
They were the top three from the studies that we did in buildings, homes all over the world. Those were the three that were over 90% of the harm was from those three contaminants. And so rather than have a whole list of 45 things that you have to control, we said, these are the important ones. Control these and you're almost all the way there.
Yeah, and there were two interesting parts to that I found. One was that, look, these pollutants, those top three, represent 80-90% of the harm that we're seeing in those spaces. So actually, if you deal with those well, you're reducing that harm factor significantly. So concentrating there is a good place to look. But I think for me, that again, kind of going back to what levers do we have to pull in our spaces to affect an outcome? They're beautifully representative of our built environment. You know, you've got particulate matter, which is an engineering problem to solve, to filter out, to exhaust, to eliminate from the built environment with combustion products. And, you know, we understand well how to manage that. Formaldehyde was a beautiful reflection of source control, of building materials, of understanding background rates and their impact on those pollutants that are, if they're there, how are you going to treat them? And then nitrogen dioxide, which was a reflection of, you know, combustion in the home and electrifying the homes, as we're seeing across a lot of the globe, but also our homes' interaction with things like outdoor air pollution and traffic pollution. So as a kind of a manifestation of how we ventilate spaces and manage spaces, they're three great pollutants to look at, aren't they?
Yeah, yes, they are. They weren't really chosen, but they are actually three different classes of pollution in that sense, with formaldehyde being the poster child for pretty much all VOCs. That's the most important one. And then nitrogen dioxide is an reactive species, a reactive oxygen species. So that's why it's important. And as you said, it's a surrogate for pretty much all combustion related activities. There were a few others that were not considered, they were considered, but didn't wind up being in the standard, which were like ozone, which is principally an outdoor contaminant. And the harm studies actually show that ozone isn't quite as harmful as you would infer from the levels that people have set from outdoor exposures. And there may be some interesting reasons for that, having to do with the fact that it's reactive. But the research goes on in there. Mold can be important if you have a moldy house. So we look at the data, and when mold is a problem, but it's not a problem mostly. The same thing is true for radon, by the way. If you have radon, you have a radon problem, and if you don't live in radon-rich soils, it's not a problem.
Yeah, and welcome to environmental risk, I guess. You know, like depending on where you live and the environment around you and your activities in the home and around the home, risk is going to manifest differently for different people. I think at a national level or at a standards level, you're trying to reflect the broad spectrum of potential. But yes, absolutely. I'm sure if you live in a home riddled with mold is right up there. as a risk factor. That's the interesting thing about it, and that's always the weakness of a standard as well, isn't it? Is that it's standards are there for typical buildings in typical scenarios with typical use patterns. Like it's impossible to cater for all edge cases when you're developing these things. You have to take a kind of a broad stroke approach and at some point make a judgment call as to where the lines are or the boundary conditions are.
That's right, and almost all standards kind of say that. We're looking at the fat part of the distribution, so to speak. Where can we do the most good for the most people? And so the edge cases, the tails of the distribution are simply not it's not going to be sufficient for them. If you live in a moldy house, or if you are sensitive to something or another, or you're a vulnerable population for some health reason, the standards are not going to be enough. But they were never designed to handle all of that. They were designed to be required everywhere, so that everybody would get a minimum level of protection, which wouldn't be enough for edges, for tails.
Yeah, it must come back onto minimums, but it was a conversation I was only having yesterday about engineering and the role of engineering, and the role of engineering is to understand these standards, and as you say, the fat of the bell curve, so to speak, of how you treat it, but also to understand how much redundancy to build into solutions, how much capacity to leave spare in case you need it. We should be building spaces where we build broadly for the typical scenario, but we've got enough flexibility in our designs to turn it up a bit if we need to, or turn it down a bit if we've overshot the mark for some reason. That's good engineering. But often this is the challenge we find in the built environment, is standards that kind of minimum becomes the maximum scenario, where we see these numbers and they become the target somehow, rather than fundamentally understanding the role of that particular engineering solution. And that's a time immemorial problem of ventilation in the built environment, isn't it?
Well, not just ventilation in the built environment. It's pretty much has to do with all standards, in that when you're writing a minimum standard that you intend everybody to follow, you can't include all the things that you want to. We would like a standard to be resilient, that is, to be able to adapt to epidemics or to wildfires or all these things. And we could write such a standard, but it would be enormously expensive to do for every building that there was. And so it wouldn't be adopted as a mandatory code, and it would lose and so there would be very many homes that were simply not built even to what the minimum standard that we have now is. They would just ignore it. So it's a political trade-off. It's what you want. It has to do with all sorts of non-ventilation, non-IAQ related things, like the economy, the wealth of the society, the priorities of the society. And if the priorities of the society were that everybody should live in a wildfire-resistant home, and they were willing to pass a law to do that, it could be done, and it would simply increase the price of every single home in the country.
Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective. I think if you were parachuted in from outer space and you were asked the question, well, does this approach work as it is? Objectively, the answer would be no. And I don't know. I can't say why it's a no, but we've worked to minimum standards for a very long time, and I understand completely why they exist. But the reality is that I don't know of a country where we go and assess whether we're actually meeting those minimum codes or not, and don't find widespread failure to do even that. So somehow this approach isn't working either. And that, yes, that's a policing problem, a skills and labour problem, like you say, a socio and economic problem. There's lots of reasons why we find when we go out and look at homes that they don't meet those minimum codes. But fundamentally, for me, the bottom line is that if your target is the minimum, then what happens is any failure in that supply chain at any point means the default position is not reaching the minimum. And that's the challenge we have. The a design only has to be a bit out, a product only has to deteriorate a bit quicker than we expect. An installer's having a bad Friday, user isn't using it quite right. If the goal was the bare minimum, the default, and this is why, the big study in the UK, 95% non-compliance with the minimum standards for ventilation systems. Now, a lot of those was just an undercut was missing under one of the doors, or a fan wasn't quite doing the flow rate. There's lots of reasons why you don't quite hit that minimum. Some of them might be quite minor, some of them could be pretty major, but the end result is the same. On paper, you look at it and you see failure to meet these standards.
Right. Well, you don't get what you want if you don't measure it. So in this case, that would be called commissioning. Where somebody goes in and checks to see that it was built the way it was supposed to be built. And it always works. When you institute a program like that, all of a sudden you get a very high compliance rate. And if you don't, you don't. It was like in the early days of air leakage testing, blower door testing, we set up air leakage requirements for homes. And the Germans didn't want to play because they said, well, that's an absolute waste of time. We're Germans. We build tight. We know that. We don't have to measure it. Until a few years later, somebody went in and measured and found out that, no, they didn't build tight at all. They were very upset that they weren't getting that. But it's no surprise. If you don't check, you don't get. And that's true of the minimum standards. So before you worry about making the standards tougher, make sure that you actually meet them in the field.
Yeah, and you're pushing on an open door with me there, particularly on the commissioning. I think it's been one of my tropes of this year. Really, has been you've been paying good money for ventilation. The problem you've got is that you've not been checking that you've been getting what you've paid for. That's the problem. Fundamentally, this is a consumer protection problem. This is a delivery problem, and the reality is you're not getting what you paid good money for. So I have this conversation with public housing quite a bit. You're spending an inordinate amount of money replacing ventilation systems and fixing damp and mold and doing this and doing that, but you've objectively failed to check whether or not, when somebody turned up, the measurement of success, I joke, the measurement of success is that somebody stuck something on a wall and it made a noise when the electrician left. That's kind of the level you're at. And so is it any wonder that we find fans, blowing air into the plasterboard directly behind the fan? No, it never actually made it outside at all, because the electrician got paid because he got paid for a fan that made a noise when the light came on. That was the measurement of success.
Right. And the argument is, well, if we do that, we can, that'll cost us 10 or 15% of the money to do it. And so we won't be able to do as many of whatever we're trying to do. That's the usual argument from that. But the reality is a bit different. It may, you begin by commissioning every single one, but once you're dealing with a set of people who know what they're doing and do it right, you can commission a smaller and smaller fraction over time, so that you're just basically random checking a few. And of course, if they fail, then you start checking more. And it can be reasonably cost effective to do that. That's the sort of trust but verify option. Once you verify that somebody knows how to do it, you trust them to mostly do it, but you check them every now.
Yeah. And as I've been saying to people, we're moving into a period of time where a lot of our indoor environments are going to be monitored for, at least basic air quality parameters. So at some point you're going to be judged, or your brand will live and die on the ongoing performance of those spaces. And that's a very different world to operate in than just being held to account because your fan didn't do 15 litres a second when you left. You may start to be judged on whether you were able to keep the moisture levels in that room under control, or the PM levels. And that's a very different space to be in, but it's not very far away, and I think if you're involved in the delivery of indoor environments, if you're not taking that into account in the way you approach those spaces, you're leaving yourself open to risk at some point, because there's nothing worse. And I know you get involved in legal cases. There's nothing worse than being presented with data and trying to argue your case. That at some level you find in most documents and specs, at a fundamental, your job was to provide a decent indoor environment. And if you don't do that, you've got some questions to answer.
Yes, but that usually doesn't work very well, at least in the American legal system, because your job was to meet a regulation. And the regulation says, you have to install a fan or whatever it says. It doesn't say you have to provide good indoor air quality. So if you've done everything the standard and regulation told you to do, and it didn't work, it's not your fault. So that's the argument. Now, if you installed a fan that wasn't actually connected to the outside, and the standard said, it has to exhaust so much air, yeah, you're in trouble then.
Yeah. We call that prima facie compliance, of course. On the face of it, if you follow these rules in a typical scenario, in a typical environment, there's a good chance you're covered. And that's the way most standards are written. They say, look, these are numbers that are designed for typical buildings in typical scenarios. And the challenge there is that you're then arguing whether or not that building fitted that criteria. And there's a lot of environments that don't, of course. That's the challenge. And you find yourself in a precarious position. I think the interesting thing about the harm work is I wonder how that will change things and manifest over time. Do you have a vision for how you see or think something like 62.2 could be used when we start to look at formaldehyde and particulate matter and start to actually be judged on those?
Well, I think there's a path forward along those lines. We now have the harm intensities that give us a reasonable estimate of what the harm is from exposure to these indoor contaminants. So that can tell us something quantitative. Ultimately, I could see where the standard is based on dolly levels, and then any way you want to get them is okay. But that's a very long road from where we are now. Now we have it as an alternative procedure where you have these three contaminants that you can do, which will allow you to lower ventilation rates if you meet them. We need people to use that. Obviously, it's just come out. That means it's not in any regulation or program yet because they haven't referenced it, which means nobody except some very bleeding edge research types may even be looking at it. So it'll take a few years for people to actually use it, get some experience with it, find out the problems. In the meantime, the science can go on and improve the numbers that the harm intensities were based on. That will evolve. And maybe other contaminants will appear. Maybe some will disappear. Maybe NO2 will disappear because nobody will do indoor combustion anymore and we'll have cleaned it in the outdoors. Who knows? But it gives us a path forward other than just a group of people in a star chamber trying to guess what the right ventilation rate is, which is kind of what it's been for the last 50 years.
So do you think it will be a design tool first before something that's used to judge the effectiveness of a space? Or ultimately, is it something that's you hope will be used to say, okay, incorporated in demand control ventilation, for example, and you're saying, right, okay, this system is going to react to that space based on this standard?
Right. Well, isn't that a design tool?
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, I look at it as a design tool from that standpoint. You could also use the harm work to evaluate any indoor environment, right? We've got these 45 chemicals. If you measure, if you measure them, especially the important ones, you can then estimate what the harm is from that particular indoor environment, having nothing to do with a 62 standard, just based on the harm work. And hopefully, people will start doing that in a research environment. And someday it could be done in a more production environment.
Practically, I'm struggling to picture how that will work. If you're, do you, is the output of 62.2, and forgive me because I haven't read it, ultimately thresholds for those pollutants? Is that work kind of come back full circle to effectively say these are the limits we want in this space in order to achieve these harm outputs? Like,
Very strongly, the answer is no.
okay,
We're the harm work is the opposite of threshold work.
yeah,
Um, Basically, you multiply each concentration by, we call it a harm intensity, and it turns into a Dolly contribution. And the sum of all of those is what you must limit. So you can trade off particles, formaldehyde, NO2. You can have more of one and less of another, and to meet the spec. So there is no threshold. Uh, okay, if we go and look at things, um, when a contaminant, when anything was considered harmful, then people wanted to say, okay, well, what's the right limit? And a bunch of people would go into a room, and they would include the scientists who did it, the public health officials, the people who were impacted, the industry, and they'd argue until they picked a number, and that's how standards are set. They so, for example, for uh, some chemicals, the number is extremely protective. If you look at the modern toilet bowl stinkers, which are paradichlorobenzene, the limit is so stringent that there's very little harm. But nobody minds because it's easy to meet. So the industry doesn't care that much because it's easy to meet, and the health guys will say, well, lower is always better, so I'll push it low. The flip side of that is PM 2.5 is particles. It's so hard to control them that the protective level, and if you look at the standards that are typically used, is 5 orders of magnitude less protective than the paradichlorobenzene. So so it's 100,000 times less protective, but that's because in order to reduce the harm, it would be a massive cost to power plants, to utilities, to homes, to everything. To cars, and that was considered impractical. That's why thresholds I don't like. As the harm allows us to say, okay, here's what we really believe this costs people. Now optimize it all together to find out the most cost effective way to do that. And that may be really reducing one piece because it's cheap to do and letting another piece go above what might have been its threshold. So for 62.2, well, for indoor environmental quality, filtering the indoor air is a pretty easy thing to do. And PM is the big kahuna anyway. So we have a way of doing that. And maybe we can allow a little bit more formaldehyde if we filter all of the air, for example. It's much cheaper than making power plants, cars, and factories reduce their emissions of particles by an order of magnitude. That would be very expensive. So the harm approach allows us to get away from thresholds and do more engineering on a high level rather than on each individual contaminant. Which, by the way, pisses people off because a lot of the health people are focused research on their favorite contaminant, and they don't like it being mistreated. They want it so. trading off can be difficult.
And if you spent 30 years of your life looking at some obscure VOC, as interesting as it might be, you're heavily invested in that VOC. I'm quite sure. I mean, that's human nature. And,
Exactly.
I have those conversations. Yeah. What about my chemical? um, the interesting thing for me, and I still don't understand it, and forgive me, is how do you know you're successful if you don't have a threshold? So we were talking about, if you don't measure, you can't manage what you don't measure. And if you don't have commissioning, you don't know you got what you paid for. If you're creating a standard that's looking at the harm intensity, and I understand this is a formula, right? It's the amount of something multiplied by its harm intensity, whether that's toxicological or epidemiological. So it's the formula of the amount of it and the harmfulness of it. But there's the amount bit. So the measurement bit, you're not measuring the harm, you're measuring ultimately the amount of it in a space. That's how you know you're achieving what you're doing. Unless your measurement of success is the health metrics out the other side. But I imagine that's an impossible task. So at some level, I have to be able to say I've got a home that I'm trying to achieve a particular harm outcome on. And I go, well, okay, particulate matter's the thing I'm going to try and tackle. There's going to be a target value there for me somewhere. So at some level, are we not still talking about thresholds of not thresholds, but target thresholds in the sense that we're still measuring something in the space, and we want to know that we're below that level if we're successful?
That's right. We are, but it's the sum of all the harms that is our target level here. There's some level in 62.2. It says, the concentration of this times this plus the concentration of this times this plus the concentration of this times this must be a certain level.
Sure, I get that. But if we're just talking about three pollutants here under 62, we're saying, right, okay, we're going to look at PM, formaldehyde, and NO2, and so my target value is going to be 15 micrograms per meter cubed of particulate matter, 24-hour average. That will lead to a certain amount of it, which will lead to a certain harm. So at some level, I'm going to set a value, am I not? And the same for formaldehyde. I'm going to say, right,
well, you are going to set a level for yourself for this particular case. You're going to do that. But threshold levels in the context of standards usually mean levels that everybody has to meet. You must meet 12 micrograms per cubic meter in every situation.
yeah,
And so that's what I was really talking about. But yes, when you go through the engineering, you're going to say, well, okay, I need to meet this harm level, and I have these three concentrations, and that's too much. I have to lower one of them. Which one do I want to lower? How much do I have to lower it by? You do the calculation. You find out you need 5 micrograms per cubic meter of particulate PM to meet your thing. And so that's your particular target for that.
Yeah, let's call it target and not threshold, just so that we're clear on the terminology. But it's interesting that I can imagine what will ultimately happen is you'll have the equivalent of pattern books or design briefs that say, in these types of homes, in order to meet these harm intensities, you're going to want to target values of PM and formaldehyde and NO2 at these levels, and effectively they become the same thing. That you end up with what effectively are target stroke thresholds for those spaces, because nobody practically, when it comes to engineering, is going to be doing the kind of considered thought work that you and your team have done around harm intensities. They're going to go, that's great, Max, but what number do I need to hit? Right.
There'll certainly be guidance on how to hit it in a certain kind of housing. Some people will write that, or builders will calculate it once for what the whole subdivision that they're doing, and they will say, okay, this is what we're going to do. And I imagine it's really going to amount to, I don't even want to have to think about it, so I'm just going to put in good filters in this house, which is much easier for us in the US, where we use forced air systems.
Yeah.
So that the people who are going to have the hardest time are the people who want to rely on natural ventilation. That's going to be really hard to do these things unless they have design mechanical ventilation where they can apply filters or something like that. But natural ventilation makes this harder. Sort of forced air systems make it easier. Then there's in between.
While I have you, I just want to borrow your attention for a minute to tell you about Erico, a partner of this podcast. In fact, I worked for Erico for over 12 years, so I can speak with some authority here. With over 40 years of expertise, Erico has undoubtedly established itself as a market leader in DCV technology. That's demand-controlled ventilation. Their mechanical extract systems dynamically adjust airflow rates based on real-time needs. And their MVHR systems further enhance energy savings by recovering heat while delivering fresh, filtered air, both creating comfortable and sustainable environments. Their advanced solutions are tailored for residential, commercial, and educational settings, ensuring optimal indoor air quality and energy efficiency. As part of the Aldis Group and based in Paris, France, Erico continues to innovate and set benchmarks for the industry. Their solutions seamlessly integrate into buildings, providing intelligent, efficient, and reliable ventilation tailored to the unique demands of each space. With a global footprint, Erico, as part of the Aldis Group, are a powerful partner in securing good indoor environments and are well worth checking out. Links are in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net and, of course, at Erico, spelt aereco.co.uk. Now, back to the show. And I completely understand this idea behind removing this sense of an arbitrary decision being made by a group of people behind a closed door. I mean, you and I have had long conversations about this at this stage, that there's some scientific rigor brought to bear, that the best tool that we have is the evidence of the pollutants that we find in spaces, the epidemiological and toxical evidence of the impacts it has on us, and using a metric like DALYs to try and pull it all together to give us something that we can use to quantify it all. And that whether you agree with DALYs or not, we've had conversations about this, or whether you agree with the evidence that exists at the moment for particulate matter or not, those are all things that can be worked through over time. If you don't like the science that's producing if you think your favorite pollutant isn't well counted for, then you can go and do more research and put more numbers into the mix. Like that's the beauty of that approach, isn't it? It's not down to whether or not the asthma lobby had a particularly effective person at that particular time when they were coming up with that number in that room. That this becomes there's a scientific rigor behind it.
Right. There's always a trade-off between the science and the practical aspects. And so when those people are in that room making the decision, they're all probably acting in good faith, but they're all doing it in a very narrow context. So it might make sense that if the only thing you ever cared about was this thing, whatever it was, that the number they came out with was quite reasonable. The problem is we just don't only care about one thing. And so you want to make the practical trade-offs at the highest level possible that allow the engineers the ability to trade things off at a lower level, to trade off, occupancy, sources, which contaminants to use, all these things. You want to give maximum flexibility, and that's what the harm approach tends to do. It says, okay, we want the total harm to be X, and what that total harm is a political trade-off. Right? It can be higher, it can be lower. That's something for the people in a closed room to get together and say. But the harm intensity part is it's not political. It may, as you say, it may need improvement, but it's science. And so people don't need to get into a room in a dark room and decide what those are. They just look at the data and should come to a clear conclusion on what that is. So that's the beauty of the harm approach.
Yeah, and I think anybody that's been involved in an ASHRAE committee, a standards committee, whatever it is in your part of the world, you know how painful these kind of standards by consensus processes are, that there's so much brought to bear. And if you've got particularly aggressive lobbyers from one aspect or another, they can have huge influences and dilute or intensify outcomes. There's a lot at play, but particularly in these kind of multi-systems decisions, something like air quality, where you've got a lot of actors that have an opinion on it. It's a really complex space, and you will get answers that are compromises somehow, and that's what you start to erode when you move towards a more scientific approach like the harm work, where you say, no, this is just calculate, this is just based on the evidence that we have, we run it through a machine, and these are the numbers you get. Now, like you say, what you want that number to be, that comes back to a decision of finance, politics, whatever it is. But ultimately, it's just being put through something that's transparent, that says, okay, well, if you don't agree with that particular research on whatever it is, benzene or limonene, show me better evidence, and we'll put it into the machine, and we'll see what number it comes out with.
That's right. We were lucky. The IAQ approach, this harm approach in 62.2, only took 5 years. That's pretty fast.
Yeah. Congratulations. Yeah.
But the reason is we didn't pick a number. Rather, we said we just want it to be equivalent to what the ventilation rate procedure currently provides. So what we did was we did a study, Department of Energy did a study of a bunch of homes that met the standard with the ventilation rate and measured the concentrations of these things. And then we could essentially calculate what Dolly value that produced. And we just set the formula to be equivalent to that. So that saved the whole argument of what level it should be. We just made it the same level. Now, in the future, people say, well, maybe we should be more stringent, or maybe we should be less stringent. And then they can change the level together so that the Dolly level changes, and then the ventilation rate can change as well in lockstep. So that was our speed trick, so to speak.
Now, we're talking here about DALIs, and I don't want to assume that everybody listening to this is as fully aware of the harm work that you've done as well, obviously you are, and I am, having spoken to you lots about it. But what we're talking about with DALIs is a disability adjusted life year public health index, effectively, that looks at the years lost to disability and early death as a result of a particular risk, and it's usually done per 100,000 of the population. So it basically spits out a number that combines the impact on your long-term health and well-being and the impact on early death as a result of an exposure to certain risks. And as a simple example, the DALI at a population level per 100,000 of the population to smoking is in around 2,600 years lost to disability and early death. And we consider that number an intolerably high number, and therefore at a public health level and a government level, we invest lots of money in helping people not smoke, right, or be exposed to smoke. And similar DALIs are done for road traffic accidents, alcoholism, you name it. It becomes a very useful tool for compressing everything into something that we can use to measure risk and harm. Is that a fair summary of DALIs, Max?
Yes, it is. It was really in the late 20th century where people were developing this concept. We didn't develop this concept, obviously, but when we used it to try to make indoor air quality, put it on the same level as these other risks, and that's exactly correct. And the The study that we did showed that unventilated homes from probably had only about 10% fewer dollies, 20% fewer dollies than smoking. Did directly. In other words, a big number, and that if you follow 62.2, you cut that down by about a factor of 3, just in rough
Wow.
numbers. So and probably that would be true of the European standards for ventilation as well. So it's important. We used to say that indoor air quality was the fifth most important environmental threat that people faced. Now we actually have numbers. That was just a kind of a off the cuff sort of thing. So it really is quite important, and dollies are the way we quantify it. The interesting thing, and this becomes more political and technical, is how you evaluate the monetary cost of a dolly. In other words, what's the year of somebody's life worth? And different governments, different groups, different regions use very different numbers. Our EPA here in the U.S. used to use $750,000 as the value of a dolly, and when you do that, it allows you to do cost benefit analyses of policies and say, we believe we're going to save this many dollars, it's going to cost this much money, and you can decide whether it's worth it to you or not.
Yeah, it all boils down to what a life is worth, and that's at a policy level, that's what it always comes down to. Is it worth us investing another 20 billion this year in extra road safety measures if we're going to get another quarter of a Dali impact, or we're going to bring it from 1,200 to 1,150? That's what it boils. That's why these measures, these metrics become important, because they become decision tools. Somebody can, like you say, make a political decision to raise it, lower it, invest in it, not invest in it. It becomes a useful tool. So you're saying that that's an area that's still that changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, how much value is put on these DALIs, and will that change then depending on the risk that you're putting through that DALI as well? Or is a disability adjusted life year the same regardless of what created that disability
No,
adjusted life year?
it's the latter. The thing is, once you get to a dolly, it's a dolly. And you don't really care if the dolly is from traffic accidents or from PM 2.5. It's going to cost you societally a certain amount of money. So is it worth reducing it? And um, at the highest level, you could look to what's the cheapest way to reduce a dolly anywhere. And you could trade off traffic against indoor air quality. That's not yet done. Usually these areas are all looked at independently, which is the most cost-effective way to reduce traffic accidents, for example, would be something that the traffic people would look at, and they wouldn't really care that it might be better to invest their money in air filters.
And the old adage, you kind of junk in, junk out. Where's the risk with this kind of approach? Do we, in the initial phases, have we been able to accurately measure the quantity of pollutants that we find in spaces? Has the data sources for that been reliable? And equally, out the other side of the formula is the epidemiological evidence for the pollutants that we're looking at. I'm not talking all of them, because there's an enormous number of them, obviously, that went into the harm work, but particularly the top kind of 3 or 5 of them. Are you fairly comfortable on the evidence base that's producing these numbers for that? And if there are there areas that need more work, as you see it?
I'm comfortable in using the data. I don't think the data is static and completely correct. First of all, it's likely to change over time. It's very difficult to measure some of these sorts of things. Epidemiological studies have to look at very long-term impacts. So there's a lot of confounders in there. Toxicological studies don't have those confounders, but it relates on taking an animal model, turning it into a human model. So there's always a certain amount of uncertainty, and we'll get better at reducing that. Only very few of the numbers have jumped around since we first did this in like 2010. for example, acrolein came out very high. It's a product of combustion. The first time we did this, and it dropped way down with better data.
And what drove that? Was that epidemiological evidence drove it down, or the amount of it you were finding in spaces wasn't accurate?
It was the toxicological evidence.
Okay.
Only a few of the parameters, but the important ones, have epidemiological data. Toxicological data is a lot easier to generate. So I think we have maybe half a dozen that have epi data and 40 some that have toxicological data.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, they did better lab analysis. They looked at the models and they concluded that it's not important as we thought it was. So
yeah, and I know
that could happen.
And I've had this conversation with Ben as well a couple of times, particularly if you're looking at stuff at the lower runs, if the evidence is overwhelming for particulate matter and your particular favorite flavor of VOC is really low down the list, we would have to be wrong about that particular VOC by orders of magnitude for it to have even a dent in the impact of something like the ones at the top of the list. Like, for people that haven't seen the slides of this work, the difference between the top 5 and 6 and even the middle of the 60 or 40 odd whatever pollutants that were being talked about is astronomical, isn't it, from a harm perspective? Like, crazy.
Yeah, I think that the top 6 are 99% of the harm, and
yeah.
the other 40 are all much lower. So yes, I'm comfortable using the data. I expect the data to evolve over time. It's certainly possible that there's something that's giving us harm that we have no idea about. It's possible, but unlikely because somebody would have bumped into it. But all of that is possible. Science will march on and improve the numbers and change them. But I think they're much better than the wild ass guesses that people were using for how important something was before.
Yeah, and I think when you look at that list of the top 5 anyway, they're so fundamentally different in their nature that it's not that there's some weird crossover thing going on between them. The impacts of particulate matter are going to be very different from the impacts of radon, for example, or nitrogen dioxide. These are very different in their nature, but they also are very different in their mechanisms on health. So I don't think that it doesn't look, it's not like you've got a list of 6 very similar VOCs at the top of the list and you can be arguing about the air chemistry of them time immemorial. You've got physical things that float in the air, gases that come off of building materials, stuff that happens when you light and burn stuff, stuff that comes out of the ground and stuff that comes in because the sun shines, and the odd bit of electrical equipment. I mean, they're all completely different.
Yes, they are. And so that's why I do feel reasonably confident that we can use these numbers. It also supplies for the researchers, for the academics, for the people who are looking at what to investigate. It gives them sort of a roadmap for what we think is important, and they can, disprove that, find something else. It kind of tells them where to look and where not to look when they're figuring out their research in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's well above my pay grade, but or capabilities, but because I'm not a maths person. But how important is the Dali maths in the middle of this? The bit that chews out the final number. Does it have a big impact on the final harm intensities of the different pollutants? Because I know Dali's has been one of those things where, again, groups of people go into a room and try and determine what the cost of someone's disability is. So in one way, we're trading those groups of people in one space with thresholds to people sitting in a room determining whether or not someone's disability has a certain impact on their life and a cost. So that number is important. It's the formula, the multiplier of all of this work, isn't it, that gives you the final number. it is a contentious subject, DALIs.
Well, all the magic happens in the formation of the harm intensities. That's the really hard part, and that's what um, Gio Morantis did his PhD on, is taking all the data that's in the literature for what the risk for all these diseases are for exposure to any of these things, and putting it all together to what the risk of a particular disease and what the DALI impact of that disease is. These are all things derived from the literature, and of course, all of them will evolve over time. Some of them are stronger than others, but that's the hard part, and it's certainly possible to change. But in those closed rooms, they're arguing not about costs or values of lives. They're arguing about what is the risk of this exposure to this disease, and they all have data in front of them. So they may not all agree, but they're in a much narrower scientific argument, and then we just add it all up to get the harm intensity.
Yes and no. I think, one of the things that they've done within the DALIs, for example, is they exclude the impact of early death and disability pre-birth. Right. So somebody at some point has made they argue, a political decision for a number of different reasons, that we don't count the cost of early death and disability until you're born. And one of the, and I understand why that is for a number of different reasons, but one of the things we definitely know with air quality is the impacts on the fetus and the mother of exposure to pollutants when a mother is carrying a child. So arguably you could say that it would make some sense to understand the cost of air quality, of exposure to pollutants, whatever the medical term is for before you're born. But the reason that that's not included in DALIs was an arbitrary decision, a political decision ultimately. So it isn't without those kind of decisions. It isn't purely looking at numbers. Somebody has to say, this is where we draw the lines, or this is what we think a disability is worth. And so it is a contentious metric in that sense, but it's the best we've got. I've had this conversation with you. Well, if you don't like it, what do you use? A QALY? Do you use one of the other? How do we find a metric to determine disability? That DALIs is probably the best we've got. It's imperfect, I think, is the answer, but I don't know of anything else. That's the challenge.
Right. Those are sort of two different issues, and I agree DALIs are the best because to do, but I don't know that we have the data to figure out what the lifetime impact is on a person from exposure before they're born. I don't know that we have the data to make that calculation, because that would be very difficult. You'd have to know what the fetus, what the mother was exposed to while she was pregnant, and subtract out all the other things that person had after they were born. So I don't know that we have it, but if we did, then it would be a legitimate thing to do. Now,
I know that work exists, Max, because there's a lot of evidence, for example, of the impacts of asthma incidents on exposure of the mother to pollutants during term. So we know that there is evidence, epidemiological evidence, that shows the impacts of disability, and I imagine miscarriage and early death from exposure to pollutants. So I know that work happens. I know that. I don't think there's no work, but I think, like you say, maybe is there enough evidence to show? I think the reason, to go back to the pre-birth thing, I think one of the reasons, as I understand it, that it wasn't included, and people could please email me and correct me, is that if a child has a disability from the very beginning of life as a result of an exposure to a risk, that's an incredibly costly DALI that you're adding into the mix. Whereas most disabilities and early deaths are happening towards the end of life because of an accumulation of exposure to something, right? So if you were to include the impacts pre-birth, you're potentially adding into a mix of a very weighted number that's going to have an impact ultimately on DALYs. It's the same argument of the impact of disability versus death in a DALY. You know, there's a much death is a one, right? Isn't it? Whereas a disability, somebody's making a fractional decision of what it's worth to have that disability compared to death. Ultimately, that's basically the formula, isn't it?
It would be a big driver, but it also would go back infinitely in time, because whether the mother's mother gave her a disability, which then caused her to have a kid who was, I mean, it would be very hard to do. And I haven't looked into any of this, so I'm
just spitballing with you. I think the reason I was asking you was I don't know, and it was the question I was asking what impact ultimately the DALY calculation has. You know, again, it kind of goes back to that. Well, if PM is so harmful, even if we're wrong on the DALY formula by 20%, it's going to make no meaningful difference out the other side of it, because you're still going to have PM as the major problem to solve. And this ultimately is about solving problems, right? What levers do we need to pull to improve an outcome? And so even, you know, we might be, I don't know, just splitting hairs, and it actually makes no difference objectively to the outcome.
Well, I think it's going to depend what you decide the outcome is, because if your mother is exposed to whatever the pollutant is, and that affects her ability to care for you before, you know, while you're a child, that's going to have an effect on you as well. So it may not be rationally possible to sort that all out in the same way we do for the exposure, for your own exposure.
And look, I'm not sure as engineers getting into an argument as to when life starts is going to be healthy for any of us.
Yes, well, we're certainly not going to have that argument.
No, it's really interesting. I still think it's interesting. Maybe I'll frame the question in this way. If you were to look back in 5 years' time at this work that you've done with harm intensities, what would success look like for you? Where would you like to see us in another half a decade with the work that's been done with harm intensities?
Well, I certainly would like us to move our thinking of indoor air quality, or for that matter, indoor environmental quality, away from arbitrary limits on things like airflow towards harm. And so getting harm numbers for everything would be very useful, because then we can put it in context with everything else that causes us harm and minimize it. So that's the direction I would like it to go. And I do have a deadline for that, and that is in 9 years. I have a target of getting rid of the ventilation rates in our air quality standards.
Yeah, and I think if anybody listens back to the first episode, I think you mentioned that in the first episode that you've got it's either an age deadline or there's something where you're saying, I want this done by the time I'm this, because
it's my 80th birthday, so that's my target.
I think that's a very admirable target. But look, you know, we should be in a position with the way technology is moving that we should be able to judge the success and failure of a space by its ongoing performance. Like that's not beyond the realms of possibility. I mean, like we're not far off with these three pollutants with ongoing relatively low cost monitoring. We certainly know we can measure particulate matter relatively well now at a low cost level. I know there's plenty of people who are going to be running around with their hair on fire when I say that, but like we're in a much better place than we were 10 years ago. You know, I certainly remember the first days of my exposure to the AIVC. Some of the results we were seeing from low cost particulate matter sensors were pretty extraordinary. But we're getting better. And again, even with the nitrogen dioxide and formaldehyde, the electrochemical sensors are improving all of the time. I mean, for people, I've said it often, behind me here, I've got a low cost or relatively low cost formaldehyde sensor in one of those devices, and it's on the money. Like, I've got actual formaldehyde in a pipette, that it will react to very definitively with almost no cross sensitivity on the TVOC sensor that's in there. Like, this thing is specifically spotting formaldehyde in that space, and it's specifically not reacting to all of the other things that trigger the VOC sensor. So yes, there's plus and minus sensitivities to it, and there's questions about calibration and longevity and all of that stuff. I know that, but we're in a position where a little white box on a shelf is actually right now measuring PM, nitrogen dioxide, and formaldehyde in this room, and that's a great place to be. If we think in half a decade's time how far that's likely to go, we're not a million
Right.
miles.
No, the question will be the race between whether that gets so much cheaper and better, or whether we'll simply remove formaldehyde from our building materials. So, it's better not to have the source than to have to remove it. PM will forever be difficult because everything generates PM, but formaldehyde probably doesn't have to. And products of combustion can also be greatly reduced. And
Yeah,
so
it's one of the funny things, actually. I mean, I've got no combustion in this house whatsoever. I mean, apart from a gas cooker that comes from bottled gas, actually, so it produces almost no NO2 whatsoever. And I've had to check that it even works, the sensor, because there's nothing on it that says there's NO2. So in some of these scenarios, the ideal scenarios is you don't need the sensor because there's no reason to think that there's an unreasonable amount of that pollution in the space, right?
Right. The harm work also helps us, therefore, identify what are the sources we should work on. There's all sorts of things that get emitted, thousands of compounds that get emitted all the time, but they don't seem to matter very much. So we don't need to worry about them today. But the half dozen things that poke up, those are the things that we want to see if we can reduce. For example, you really don't want anything in your home that generates ozone,
Yeah.
either intentionally or unintentionally. So that's and there's standards for equipment so that you can tell that it doesn't. And ideally, we'd like materials not to emit formaldehyde. So these are other ways of improving indoor air quality.
Yeah. Yeah. And I see that, the room that I'm in produces formaldehyde, but it's full of furniture. It's a smallish room. So it's not surprising that there's some background level of formaldehyde, and I move that to another space in the house and it step changes, so it's definitely picking up a background level of formaldehyde. But it doesn't, like I say, it doesn't pick up any NO2. And there's always CO2 max. We can always measure CO2 as the catch-all for ventilation effectiveness and general good air quality, can't we?
Well, CO2 is a plus minus sort of thing. It is not a contaminant. Uh, it is not a contaminant at the rates that we have in buildings. And when you get up to about 3,000 parts per million or higher, CO2 itself is a contaminant. But we don't have that in buildings. At the levels that we normally have in buildings, CO2 is unimportant in terms of harm. It can be used as a tracer gas. That is, it's very useful if you want to figure out the ventilation rate per person, since people generate CO2 at a reasonably knowable rate. You can then use people as the emitter of this tracer gas. You can calculate it. It's great. The problem is too many people think CO2 is an indicator of indoor air quality, and it's not. It's simply not. So there is no reason to require CO2 below, let's say, 1600 ppm. Uh, there's a reason to require ventilation. There's a reason to require indoor air quality control, but CO2 is not a good indicator, and yet people have been convinced that it is. And this is an international problem. where people think CO2 is important and it's not.
Yeah, and for the audio listeners there, I was doing the motion of chucking grenades at Max when I mentioned CO2 because I know nothing gets Max more animated than misunderstandings around things like CO2. I mean, I think I think the
I thought it
interesting
was a
thing,
softball, actually.
a softball, actually, yeah, it could be either, actually. The, but even the tracer gas thing, without understanding context and space and appropriateness of using it as a tracer gas in that particular space, it can be almost completely useless as a metric as well. So, like, it's a number that's deeply flawed when it comes to understanding whether a space has got reasonable air quality or not. And probably the most obvious binary example of that is when we start looking at standards like 241, where we may be supplementing outdoor air and the dilution of CO2 with filtration and UV and other ways of cleaning that air. You could get very foreseeably, as 241 understands it, good air quality outcomes with higher levels of CO2. The two aren't permanently joined at the hip when it comes to air quality outcomes.
The goal in 241 is to reduce infectious aerosols. And it requires that you first meet a base ventilation standard for indoor air quality. And so you're going to have a certain amount of outdoor air based on whatever base ventilation standard you use. If you're in the ASHRAE world, that would be 62.1 or 62.2. That would tell you the base level. Then you have to add stuff to remove the infectious aerosols. And it could be more outdoor air, but in most places in the world, that's not the most cost-effective way to do that. You can do it with all those other air cleaning options you measure, which will have zero impact on the CO2. So CO2 is therefore not a good indicator of indoor air quality. It's not a good indicator of indoor health. It's not an indicator of infection control. It's an indicator of outdoor air per person if, as you say, you know what you're doing. It's, you're right. It does require some skills to use it correctly, but, that's not uncommon. People in the field know how to do it correctly, but you can't use CO2 correctly except in the very restricted situation where you have eliminated all the other options.
Yeah, but equally, I have to say, I find it a very useful tool for reminding me to do something about the spaces that I'm in. That in my office here, I'll see the CO2 creep up. Often the lights behind me here on the sensors will change color, and I go, "Oh, yeah, crap! I better do something about this." So, as a precise tool, it can be very limited, but as a guide, as an indicator, I have to say, practically, understanding all that you've said, with relatively little knowledge, I can know in certain spaces, if I see CO2 creeping up, that there's potential risk with that. And I can I'm not going to know precisely what that is, but I know that I might react in a different way depending on what that scenario is. Open a window, remove myself from that space, put a mask on if I'm vulnerable. There are things that I might consider doing as I see that number climb. As a good bet.
Well, if it's high, there's something wrong. Whatever your base standard is, maybe you normally would be running at 1,200 ppm of CO2. I don't know that. Let's assume it's that. And then you see it creep up to 1,600 or higher. Something's wrong. You're not getting what you're supposed to get. It's a good diagnostic for that. But saying that you want 1,000 ppm always is or 800 is silly. It's almost never the right thing to do. So yes, as a diagnostic, to tell you that something bad has happened, it's fine, but it doesn't tell you if something good is happening. So it's a bit different. It's kind of like TVOCs. TVOC means nothing. But if you all of a sudden see that the normal TVOC level changes from what it is, goes way up. Something has happened. May be important, may not be important, but something has happened. So if that red light goes on, you might look around. Now, maybe you just poured yourself a whiskey because most of them are pretty sensitive to ethanol. So, and it goes up and you say, well, that's okay. I can handle this, and have a sip of your whiskey, but maybe it means something else happened. So it's worth looking around.
Yeah, I think there's always a thing of understanding who the user is, and I think you can make a pretty solid argument that, let's just say, in a classroom, if you're and it's typically occupied and it's naturally ventilated, and it doesn't have all of the tools we're talking about for 241, your dilution of let's say infectious aerosols in that space is going to be outdoor air for the vast majority of students. I think it can be a very useful tool in not determining precisely what the metric of good is, but certainly limiting the risk of harm. I think, setting a target value of below 1,000 parts per million in a classroom full of kids in a period of a pandemic, or where you've got a vulnerable person in that space, objectively makes a lot of sense. I'm not. You won't know whether somebody's infectious. You won't know whether there's 3 people infectious. Won't know what their R value is or how infectious they are. They're all unknowns. But what I can know is that if I've got a room full of kids and I can keep that classroom below 1,000 parts per million, I'm getting a reasonable amount of dilution in that space, and that's a safe bet. And so in those kind of scenarios, it can be pretty. So that I think we can, in the right context and the right spaces, it can be a very valuable tool.
I would agree. You have to have the right context, and you have to know what you're doing, just like you mentioned with using it as an indicator of ventilation per person. It has to be interpreted correctly. The problem is that you get people saying you need 800 ppm, full stop, and setting there. Okay, the standard is going to be you have to have 800 ppm, full stop. Well, that is a stupid thing to say. There may be times when 800 ppm is what you want because you have a naturally ventilated space of a certain kind, ventilated a certain way. Then maybe you've calculated that 800 ppm is right for that space. Okay, fine, but it's not a general statement.
It's not that 800 in of itself is reflective of anything. Because it's a proxy. Ultimately, there's an assumption it keeps bad company. I mean, that's basically what we're talking about. And so if you can't be precise on what that bad company is and what the production or the production rate of or the source of that something is, right, then that number by itself doesn't mean anything, in the same way that TVOCs don't mean anything. It's just a collection of chemicals. You could have one nasty thing, 100 bad things, or 100 bad things, one good thing. It's still the same number. These proxy numbers are useful in the right circumstance, and I think maybe that's the leap we've got to get. I think the other challenge, Max, is that CO2 has become a measurement of potential positive impacts. And I think that's been misinterpreted quite a lot as well. So this, if I keep CO2 below 800 parts per million, my performance is going to be X, or there's an improvement in my cognitive function, or that, and so on and so forth. And so again, that's, you really have to understand the limitations of using that number to determine whether or not an office space is going to be more functional as a result. Right?
That's right. So it is a proxy. Everybody recognizes it's a proxy. The big distinction is what's a proxy for. What it's a proxy for is ventilation rate per person. It is not a proxy for indoor air quality. And that's what people say. Now, sometimes ventilation rate per person can be a proxy for indoor air quality as a secondary thing, but that's what it's a proxy for. Now, these issues of productivity and sleep quality, the data on all of those is very weak. There are studies that can go in any direction, and that's because these studies are very hard to do. These studies are very hard to do because they require a large number of people to actually get the statistics right. And so you see studies that can go either way, and the people quote the studies they want that tend to make the point that they want. So I don't put much stock in them either way.
Is it straw manning it? Well, to steel man the argument for a moment, could CO2 levels be analogous in a lot of ways to minimum standards in that they're not designed to give a precise outcome. They're there to provide a floor that catches typical scenarios in typical use spaces and so on. That yes, you can make the argument that in the same way that having 7 litres or 4 litres a second per person is an arbitrary number, that we say in a typical scenario that's going to provide an air quality outcome that's acceptable, right? These are all really woolly terms, but they're woolly for a reason. So is CO2 just not another version of that? You say, yeah, well, look, a target of 800 parts per million in classrooms is just another minimum standard. It's just another metric that we say, if you do this, if your 8-hour average occupied use is 800 parts per million or below, that's the minimum standard we require. Is there anything wrong with that?
Well, in one sense, no. It's just that you have the wrong number. So if you want to be a minimum standard, the minimum standard, you actually answered your own question. If you have 3.5 liters a second per person, that's 1600 ppm. And so if you say that's the minimum, the absolute minimum that you want, fine. So you can do it in terms of CO2 instead of liters per second per person. That works. It's the thing that 800 is a maximum, not a minimum. That's if you wanted to do 241 with all outdoor air, 800 might be the right number. And that becomes a maximum amount of ventilation that you want, which isn't what it goes in the minimum standard. So you can look at it as part of a minimum standard, but the number is much higher in a minimum standard. And then you have to do better than that. And the better than that may lower CO2 or may not, depending on what you are doing in the space.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about a minimum flow rate in a space is that you can measure it and you can know whether you're above or below that number. You can engineer unless you have demand controlled ventilation that's going to react to CO2 levels, you're going to have to make an assumption that a certain flow rate with a certain occupancy in that space is going to deliver that number. And you're not in control of one of the determinants, which is how many people end up in that space, for example. So it's a number you could fail to hit with something that's outside of your control, right? So it's no good as a stat, but we see it. I mean, you see it in school standards. The UK has BB 101, which is a standard for school ventilation, and it identifies, I think, 1,000 parts per million for mechanically ventilated classrooms and 1,500 for naturally ventilated ones, which I think shows the limitations of that as a metric just by the fact that the mechanical and the natural are different numbers. Because you don't have control of natural ventilation in the same way as you have control with mechanical ventilation. So that they give more headroom as a result, you know?
Right. Which just shows that it's not actually delivering the same thing in terms of health, in terms of protection.
Yeah.
So yes, there has been a whole generation of policymakers who believe that you can set things in terms of CO2 levels, and it's just wrong. That's it. CO2 is not a contaminant of concern. CO2 is not a surrogate for health. It's only a surrogate for ventilation rate per person. And so you set the ventilation rate, and then that'll tell you what CO2 you expect to have, and then you can demand control or otherwise do it. But it's not that the CO2 is itself at all important. And that's a message that it needs to be heard. There's even people trying to fix it by calculating effective CO2 to say that, well, it would be 800 ppm if instead of this filter I used outdoor air, so I'm giving the filter CO2 credit. That's like exactly the wrong thing to do, although people are doing it. We need to get away from talking about CO2 concentrations in public space. I mean, in the public discourse, it's a geeky little engineering indirect thing where we measure it to infer the actual ventilation rate, but it's not by itself important.
And I think it goes to show that, you know, this sector is maturing quite quickly, that we're at least having this conversation. It's a conversation that we wouldn't have been having 10 years ago, you know, about we've been having the CO2 conversation for much more than 10 years. And you speak to Andy Basili and yourself and Bill and others, like, you know, there's much hair you've lost over the years getting into arguments over whether CO2 is a good metric for this, that, or the other. It just goes to show, but it does go to show that the public perception, and because these tools were put in the hands of people in ways that they were never put in hands before. You know, the pandemic stuck CO2 sensors into classrooms and into offices, and you know, I know it's the community I'm in, but you know, how many times have you seen an Aranet picture on an aeroplane, you know, with people tutting and sucking through their teeth about the CO2 levels on their aeroplane journey since the pandemic? You know, like it's at least in the dialogue. And I think that's the useful thing, whether these numbers are precise or not, or whether it's precisely the right metric or not, we're having a conversation about air quality and seeing the air that we breathe, which is, I think, has to be a good thing at some level.
Right. The airplanes is a good example. Outdoor air is very expensive in an airplane. You have to compress it and you have to condition it. So it's worth it for them to cut it down. And what they have done is they've cut it down, but then they've added HEPA filtration so that the air is very, very clean. And you can argue whether I think they typically target things like 2,500 ppm, and they don't always do it when they're taxiing, which is a bit of a problem. This is in flight; they can make it, and taxiing they don't.
And boarding is the other time where you don't get that. But there, again, that's a really perfect manifestation of real life and real risk. Is it acceptable to have a high level of CO2 for 5 or 10 minutes while you're boarding? Versus a high level of CO2 for an 8-hour flight while you're sat next to Coffee McCoffee next to you on the flight for the next 8 hours, you know, and where is that risk, you know? And, you know, the airplane, I think the airplane journey in many ways is a beautiful representation of risk, you know, and engineering controls, isn't it? Because what's tolerable to you, what's, you know, I boarded a plane there to the States a couple of months ago, and literally the person sat down next to me and just started coughing. And, you know, I was like going, I've got 8 hours of this, of close range particulate matter. And
it wouldn't have mattered if you had twice the ventilation rate, because you're in his cloud. So now the guy 3 rows down might be affected differently if you double the ventilation rate.
Yeah.
But you're not.
Yeah. It was where did I see it on? Was it on YouTube or something the other day? An aeroplane had that they were at one point looking at ventilation through the seats of the aeroplane, where you'd have an air supply directly from the seat in front of you and the exhaust in the seats behind you, and you basically created it was basically personalized ventilation at an airplane seat level, which I thought was really interesting. But as it turned out, this woman turned to me at some point. She said, "Oh, it's the air I find on the airplane. I just start coughing." She says, "I'm not ill." So I went, I relaxed a little bit. But
she tells that to everybody.
Yeah. And I was thinking, I was still patting going, if I had an FP3 mask, I might have put it on, you know? It's really, really interesting. Max, it's been brilliant talking to you. I love our chats, and I'll book you in for 2 years' time and at episode 200 if we're both still at it.
Fair enough.
But I think it's been a really interesting walkthrough, and again, thank you so much for coming on now, and thank you so much for coming on the first episode. I think it was a nice reflective talk in many ways about what's been happening, and I appreciate it enormously. Thank you.
Well, you're quite welcome. I appreciate the fact that you're sticking to it and you're generating 100 episodes over 2 years and hoping to do another 100 over the next 2 years. I think that's really, really great.
Yeah, well, I think this has been the biggest surprise for me. It has been how broad and deep this subject matter is. You know, if my job is, or part of my job now is to talk to people about all of the different disciplines from the different perspectives of ventilation. And you realize once you get started that it's an incredibly deep rabbit hole, actually. And even the same precise subject about this, exactly the same type of building, can be completely different depending on where in the world you're having that conversation. So the as I said to you before, like at any one time, there's between a dozen and 25 people that we have in a list, a queue, basically to come on the podcast, and it that has been that way since 6 months into the podcast. Once you get going, you realize that it's an incredibly broad. It seems super niche, but actually, it's an incredibly broad church, air quality and ventilation.
And we haven't even gotten to the issues like what does the minimum standard mean in Central Africa versus in the Western world? We say that the standards apply everywhere, but do they make sense everywhere? It's another question.
Well, yeah, and that was one of the conversations we had around this UN goal about air quality, being indoor air quality being a human right. You know, it's important to say that it's true, right? That everybody has a right to breathe clean air. But that challenge manifests in dramatically different ways, depending on even within a country where in society you come from. So it's an incredibly colourful landscape, air quality and ventilation, that means so many different things to so many different people, and the challenges are offered up in hugely different ways depending on where you're from.
That's right. It's always a question of maybe it's a fundamental human right, but who has the responsibility of providing it is a whole different question. Does the small farmer in Africa, he may have that right, but who's gonna make it happen? He can't. Maybe his government probably can't, but maybe it can. Can the Western governments do it? Do they accept that as a fundamental right? And do they accept the responsibility to provide it? I think mostly the answer is no to that, but it's obviously a good question.
Yeah, and I think by setting that benchmark, you get people to think about, well, then how's that achieved in different scenarios? And one of the things I've learned, particularly talking to people from developing countries that are tackling air quality and ventilation challenges in the built environment, is the ingenuity and the tools that they create to make a meaningful difference. Those lessons can be applied not just in developing countries. Those lessons can be applied in all sorts of places. When you get good at particularly communicating and impacting habit and culture and behavior in spaces, which is often one of the big tools that we're missing in this space, there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from places that don't necessarily have the means to achieve platinum workspaces everywhere, or whatever it is your target value is, right? I think you need everything. You need that full spectrum. You need people leading the way and showing the art of the possible, and you need the ground up things that are changing how cars idle outside schools, and the distance between a classroom and a road in planning, and all of these things that don't necessarily cost money but have an impact objectively to people's exposure indoors. Like, all this stuff matters.
It does indeed.
Yeah. Max, thanks a million. Appreciate your time. We'll talk again soon. Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? Before you shoot off to whatever it is you have to do next, or even the next podcast, if you enjoyed what we've been talking about here, please do spread the word and let's keep building this community. And don't forget to check out our sponsors in the show notes. Ultra Protect, Eurovent, Erico, ACO, Farmwood and Zender, all amazing companies, and without them, this podcast would just simply not be possible. Check them out in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net, and do check out our YouTube channel. All this content is there, plus much more. See you again next week.